talking about what where you were at before you started, and just
Yeah,
kind of the things that you were worried about, right? Just the kind of the things that were scary
yeah.
about starting, right? Because it wasn't automatic, it wasn't easy, right? It wasn't like, well, of course I should like just think about
No.
how I quit my job, right? And start doing this, right? It kind of and I think starting a any kind of business is inherently has a lot of uncertainty, right? Which is
For
a huge
sure.
difference from like having a job, right? And like, knowing generally what you're gonna do day to day, right? And generally being kind of guaranteed like a paycheck.
I guess the sort of fears and hesitations sort of fell into three categories. Like fears and hesitations that were related to me personally,
Yeah. Yeah.
like like my career and my life and all those things, like me, which is naturally a part of it. Um, then there were the kind of fears and hesitations related to Pipedrive, like the company that I was sort of working at until relatively recently, where I had sort of um, where I had built my team and where I had spent many years. So there were fears and hesitations about like, how would my sort of move would impact them, my team. Like I sort of had no wish to sort of damage those relationships, obviously, and to this day, it's a very important sort of company, and it's like my team that I sort of built there is very dear to me. So like obviously that was like a whole sort of set of things to consider. And last but not least, there were the sort of I guess pretty sort of expectable the hesitations that you could expect when it comes to like starting company and the product. Um, I guess the sort of list of unknowns in that category was by far the longest.
Right.
Uh, yeah,
So let's start a little bit with your background and kind of give some context to
yeah,
it.
absolutely.
So you were with Pipedrive, but like tell us, a little bit about like what Pipedrive is, how you got started there, and just like your role there as you were starting to consider, building a company.
Yeah, absolutely. So my sort of background before Pipedrive is very mixed. So I studied journalism and PR. I worked in PR for a few years. Then I moved more towards marketing, then more towards general management. So I had never actually, I mean, I never had support in my job title before. Um, but I got hired as head of customer support at Pipedrive. So that was 2014. So 4 years ago, um, I started when the team was relatively small. So the support team, like one of the founders had been sort of leading support until I joined, and sort of for the past 4 years, like that was sort of my whole sort of work life, basically. Hiring people, sort of scaling the team. So going from, I guess we were about 7 people in one location, except for one guy, one lone soldier in California. Um, but over those years, we hired. I guess it was about, if you include some people in customer success, there was more than I guess 70 people that was involved in hiring. And most of them support agents in various locations. Like started all sorts of processes, like implemented all sorts of tools. So we went from desk.com to Freshdesk to Zendesk to Intercom. Obviously, sort of this whole sort of ticket review process, we got going with that as well. Lots of sort of other operational things like knowledge base and contextual help, and like we did phone support, we did chat support. We tried a lot of different things. And I mean, and that was like obviously well, like one of the reasons that kept me there for like a relatively long period. There was lots of things,
Oh,
lots of stuff happening.
how long were you there, and where was it at when you left? You know, like how big was the team? Where was the company as a
Yeah.
whole?
Yeah, so the company grew. I mean, the growth of the company obviously led the growth of my team as well. So when I first joined, I think I vaguely remember like celebrating 6,000 customers, and by the time I left, we had 75,000 customers. So using Pipedrive, the CRM. Oh, sorry, I didn't say what Pipedrive is. Pipedrive is Pipedrive is a sales CRM. Like I'm sort of obviously sort of so in the middle of it that I forgot to mention. Pipedrive is a CRM, so meant for salespeople. So it's like a really usable, user friendly CRM that's supposed like salespeople tend to actually want to use it. So that's so founded by two salespeople, and that's sort of like what they have been very successful at. So as Pipedrive is now, I guess like 450 people across I don't know, probably 5 different offices in Europe and in the US.
Cool.
And yeah, and my team was 60 people ish people, uh, split between 7 teams. In various offices. So I also spent 6 months of last year, so 2017, getting the Pipedrive office in Portugal started. So like that was also like a whole separate chapter there.
Right, right. So you'd been at Pipedrive for a while, you know, and the company is growing. Um, you know, your responsibilities, you know, your team is growing as well, right? So like I mean, in many ways, you know, or you know, you went through kind of like that ideal journey, right, for somebody in support, right, is to get in early and kind of grow with the company, and now you're at the head of a pretty good sized organization that, you know, and just kind of in a very good spot, right?
Yeah.
Um, and then you decided to throw it all away and start a company.
Yes.
So let's talk about that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the jury's still out, so like we'll see how this goes. We'll see how
Right.
this plays out. Uh, obviously, sort of, as you might suspect, like I became a little bit anxious, and um, I guess sort of the decision to do it was like had to do with some sort of a subconscious sort of motivation that I have had for many years, like even before Pipedrive, and I've sort of had like side projects all the time. But just none of those such side projects ever sort of turned into something like this, like where I actually sort of quit my day job to do it. So
Gotcha.
and mostly those didn't really go anywhere because my day job was just so interesting. And it's not to say that it wasn't interesting at Pipedrive anymore. But there was a moment involved in that journey where like over those 4 years I got like some sort of huge new challenge, like, you know, how about you manage this other department as well? How about you go start an office in another country? So I guess the sort of my sort of conscious subconscious expectation for getting new challenges sort of kept getting pushed higher.
Hmm. Hmm.
So if all of a sudden you don't get like that level of challenge anymore, and at some point it just like it wasn't that it was like mundane or boring, like it's never like that if the
Hmm.
company is growing by 100% a
Right.
year. Like there's just so much going on, but for me, compared to some of the previous challenges, it kind of plateaued.
Gotcha.
And it was also it was timing as well, because I started Qualitista on the side at first, so it wasn't
Hmm.
like, you know, I quit and then I started
Yeah.
thinking about like, hey, what should I do? Like I started on the side, and um, there was also like an element of timing there for sure.
Yeah. So you'd mentioned you had side projects in the past that, you know, didn't kind of get to the point where you're, you know, thinking about like quitting your job, right? And kind of doing it and running it as your full time, right? And so when did you start, like, when did this idea kind of go from idea to side project? And then when did you kind of reach a point where you started thinking about like, maybe I should, you know, maybe I should kind of like take that next step and like step away from running support at
Yeah.
Pipedrive?
Yeah, yeah. So it was definitely a long process. So like from the first moment that I had the idea that like, hey, like this should be a product, um, that was sometime like mid 2016, I think. So like quite some time ago.
Hmm.
Then like we started sort of looking for somebody to sort of build the MVP. But for sure, like the moment when I realized like, okay, this is like I should now sort of start taking steps or seriously sort of start thinking about like taking the plunge.
Hmm.
That was the moment when we got our first customer.
Gotcha. Gotcha.
So like
Right.
that was for sure like the moment where I was like, okay, like this is a real thing now.
Yeah. And so when you're in that moment, right, you're thinking about taking the plunge. What were the things that were running across your mind, right? Like, what were the things that kind of like on the personal
Yeah,
level, right? Of, you know,
all the things.
you personally for your career, right?
Yeah, so like it's kind of like a chain or like a hierarchy. So if like the first and biggest question obviously was like, should I do it? Like
Hmm.
in principle, like all things other things left aside, like should I even do it? Like is this even something that I want to do? Like you know, having been close enough to entrepreneurs, like I don't think I had like a very romanticized idea of it. I have
Right.
seen plenty of good friends that have, you know, things have started well and then sort of they've gone downhill
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
fast. So I've sort of seen those instances as well. So I was kind of like, you know, being an entrepreneur is pretty scary.
Yeah.
Uh, so like that was the first question, like do I even want to do it? But
Hmm.
then I started thinking about like, okay, but like what's the alternative then? Like, do I then want to sort of continue going down this sort of
Hmm.
path of, you know, taking one, let's call it regular job after
Hmm.
another, or,
Right.
and I kind of realized like no, eventually I would like to sort of do it.
Right.
So
Right.
that was the sort of basic answer for me, like yes, I at least want to try
Hmm.
being an entrepreneur,
Right.
because you know, and where that sort of stems from, like it's very difficult. I think it's like probably from my father's side, like he was an entrepreneur, a failed one as well. Like
Mm.
that's one of those
Okay.
like
So that's one of the things that you had seen, uh,
yeah,
or knew about, kind of, and connected to, right? Because
yeah,
like success and failure would definitely have an impact on you.
yeah, no,
Yeah.
absolutely. Because I think like despite the fact that I saw him sort of fail at
Hmm.
business,
Hmm.
I think he still instilled the idea in me that like, if you want to have, like ultimately if you want to be sort of free and independent, then like
Hmm.
that's the sort of format
Right.
you should strive towards. I think
Yeah.
like it has changed. Like that was like his mantra comes from a couple decades ago, but I think
Mhm.
it has, things have changed for the better when it comes to, you know, not being an entrepreneur, because you know we have this sort of whole, you know, remote revolution going on, and like
Mhm.
having
Yeah.
what we call a regular job is, I would say, it's way better than it used to be. So
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think there's definitely more freedom now for a lot of jobs than there have been in the past, right? And I think there's a growing awareness of the opportunities and just kind of in many ways, like, well, especially in support, I feel like it's growing up as an industry, right? And like there's more awareness around career paths and those things. Um, now you'd mentioned kind of knowing entrepreneurs that had failed, right? And kind of
Yeah.
and seeing kind of like what happened with them. So like what was scary or about their failures, right? Like so what I mean what like
I
yeah,
think
yeah.
like the scariest thing probably is hmm, seeing people that are really enthusiastic, and you know, you don't need to be like a you don't need to be a bad or a dumb person to fail at doing this,
Mhm.
because by definition this is the unknown. Like
Right,
it's
right.
a combination of so many different factors. Like it's luck, it's
Hmm.
timing, who knows what
Right.
plays into it. So you never really know how it's going to go. And like seeing a couple of people that were really super enthusiastic, and even like from looking at it from the side, seemed like they should definitely succeed.
Right.
But despite of that, like, and them sort of hitting the wall, like that was
Yeah.
definitely scary. But at the same time, I have also witnessed sort of lots of success stories up
Hmm.
close.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
I guess at the end of the day, like having seen those success stories meant more to me than
Right.
like having seen some people fail.
Right. Yeah. Um, and
And
then
then yep.
go ahead.
I was just going to say that the sort of the next question from that, like whether I should even do it,
Hmm.
was like, should I do it now?
Hmm.
Like, and just like again, leaving
Yeah.
aside like the product,
Right.
then the sort of the other sort of crucial question was like, should I do this, do it at this very particular point in my life?
Hmm.
And there, the answer was quite easy actually, because um, I started looking at it from the perspective of what are the things that I can do now that are, or I mean, you can do anything at any point, but what are the things that are sort of that make sense to do now versus other things that you can do at any time? And obviously, the answer was that like, I can get a regular job
Hmm.
at any given point
Right.
in my sort of career, and regular job opportunities will not go away.
Right.
In fact, maybe I will be better off with the experience, and knowing that okay, like I tried that, maybe I'll just stick to like a traditional career. At the same time, like when I looked at basic facts like my age,
Hmm.
where my sort of personal life, well, I don't have kids, for
Hmm.
example.
Right.
I don't have a lot of, I don't have like a massive mortgage, or you know,
Right.
uh, I felt that I was in a position where I didn't have all that much to lose.
Hmm.
And I
Hmm.
think, you know,
Yeah.
uh, the sort of harsh truth is that like that plays into it. It
Right.
matters. Like, of
Right.
course, like if you have kids to feed, and
Right.
like a big mortgage, and like student debt, or who knows what,
Right.
um, then like it wouldn't be responsible to say like, oh no, like just ignore that. It's like, of course it should play into it.
Right.
So I was in the sort of lucky position that I didn't have that, and
Right.
that basically determined my answer to the question like, should I do it now? And yes, I should do it now, because like the more time passes, the harder it's going to be, probably.
Right. If not now, then when?
Exactly.
Right. And when I'd like to dig a little bit into like when when you'd seen people fail kind of being an entrepreneur, right? And like that was scary. Like what, you know, like what happened, right? And like why was their failures like kind of scary, right? Like was it so was the scariest story of failure kind of something that someone that you knew, or was it, your dad's experience, or like, when you think of like how things could go wrong, like whose story comes to mind?
Yeah, I think to me, the sort of like in this context, the scariest stories are, I guess, the sort of scariest stories are even the ones that um, didn't end up like horribly, like
Hmm.
nobody sort of went to court or
Yeah.
like there wasn't like a huge scandal or anything.
Hmm.
I think it's just emotionally the sort of scariest ones were ones that I could see potentially happening to me,
Mm.
which were the ones where somebody had an idea and they worked really hard
Hmm.
and there just were no results. Like
Right. Right.
that to me sort of the idea of sort of really trying hard and like doing your best and then that amounting to like nothing at all.
Yeah.
That's
Gotcha.
definitely the scariest, and it's one that at that point I could relate to because I hadn't started, and
Right.
because I hadn't really started, I didn't have any results, and because I
Right.
didn't have the results, I didn't like necessarily have reason to believe there will be any results.
Yeah. Right. Right.
So the sort of the essence of it was that I was thinking like, okay, but
Hmm.
like, what if I just try and nothing
Yeah.
happens? What if there will be
Right.
no results? Then
Right.
it'll all be for nothing. Uh,
So,
yeah,
so you've seen this happen to people, right? Or people that this has happened
for
to,
sure.
and how did it go for them? Like, um, you know, how did did they realize it, right? That did they realize that it wasn't working, or was it something that you were seeing outside, and you're like looking at them saying like, clearly this isn't working, but maybe they're so they have such strong tunnel vision that they were just kind of kept digging into it, right? Like kind of I'd love to hear about like how it, you know um
Yeah.
I guess like how it didn't work and then what happened.
Yeah. So I've sort of witnessed probably like some of them closer to me,
Hmm.
some not so close,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
I've witnessed like a couple of scenarios. Like one scenario is that somebody sort of just keeps acting as if this is a really successful thing, like despite the
Right.
sort of lack of
Like
like
it's just a
actual.
matter of time.
Yeah, like this is totally inevitable that it's
Right.
going to be a massive success, and then like that's what they show to the outside, and
Hmm.
then at some point when it's clear that like even to them like, okay, this is not sort of
Right.
turning into anything of value, then
Hmm.
like in a couple of instances I've just witnessed them sort of stop talking about their previous venture and move on to a brand new one, like as
Hmm.
if the previous thing didn't
It never
exist.
happened. Okay.
Which is, I guess it's like it's mentally, maybe like compartmentalizing
Hmm.
that you sort of pull the plug and put in a new one, and then
Right.
like this basically act as if that other thing didn't happen,
Right.
which I've seen um, others that have been sort of maybe sort of mentally less healthy for some people, where they sort of there's like you can see it even from the outside that there's like a clear upward curve in terms of enthusiasm, and then it plateaus
Hmm.
and then it just starts
Yeah.
dropping slowly, and that's that seems pretty agonizing, even
Hmm.
though I think probably the former ones, they also sort of go through that, it's
Hmm.
just maybe show it.
Right. Right.
And yeah, and
Yeah.
the sort of for
Hmm.
the latter, I guess it must also be hard to be in a position where it's not clear,
Hmm.
and that's also something that I fear, like or I used to fear that,
Hmm.
like what if you end up in a situation where it's just not clear, like is it one or the other, because chances are it's like that, like the situation will not be black and white. Is
Hmm.
this going somewhere? Is this not going somewhere?
Right.
Uh,
Right.
like, how do you sort of make sense of that? Like, because
Right.
there's this sort of this sort of concept of the fog of war. Uh,
Right. Right.
where it's just if you are in it, and obviously you're going to be biased.
Hmm. Hmm.
Like how 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 do you understand like which signal is now the one you should sort of
Right.
really take seriously? Because
Yeah.
if you're in it, then it's just like all these
Oh,
signals coming from everywhere, and you
yeah,
want
it's
to
noisy. Yeah.
yeah, and you so badly you want to interpret every little piece of good news as like, okay, this is now your big
Hmm.
break or something.
Right.
So
Right. Yeah, and I think it can be hard sometimes to know, like, by going forward, are you kind of going forward like up the mountain, or are you going forward like straight into a wall? Like,
yeah, exactly,
or off a cliff, right? Like, I mean, it's
absolutely.
yeah.
That's the thing, and I knew that like there will be situations like that, but
Hmm.
my sort of rational, the sort of, and that was definitely sort of my rational side, sort of trying to come up with sort of like reasonable explanations for what I sort of emotionally felt like I was going to do it anyway. In the end,
Right.
um, but
Right.
my rational side sort of kind of said that like you're clearly not satisfied with the sort of level of emotional
Hmm.
challenge that you're getting
Right.
in your sort of current job. At the same time, you love the company and
Hmm.
you sort of think that this is a great organization,
Hmm.
which means that it's not necessarily about the company and it's not necessarily even about the job. So maybe it's about the sort of format of the challenge.
Right.
So that kind of was also part of
Yeah.
my sort of
And you'd
motivation.
mentioned some kind of fears, some concerns around leaving Pipedrive, and like in your team and the relationships that you built up. Like those were, and those are like important to you, right? And so, like, what were some of the things that were kind of running across your mind related to your team?
For sure, yeah. Well, I mean, obviously there was the sort of um, general feeling that I, I'm part of Pipedrive, and I sort of want to be a part of Pipedrive, or I mean, like at least in the past, I sort of had a very strong feeling
Mm-hmm.
like this is amazing, like this team, this culture, and so like if you're contributing to anything, like any group of people like that, and you feel that they are absolutely sort of giving back to you as well, and they're taking good care of you, then
Hmm.
naturally, if you're if you're a decent human being, then you will feel like maybe you're doing them a disservice by sort of deserting or going away. So like
Hmm.
there was that sort of that level.
Hmm.
Um, which I guess sort of again my sort of rational side said like, yeah, but you've been here for a while and it's not, nobody expects you to sort of spend your whole life here,
Right.
and you're not, it's not like you're leaving to work for a competitor or anything like that.
Right.
So there was that, and like when it came to my own team, then
Hmm.
obviously the sort of the big concern was like will I not sort of leave them in a worse position by
Hmm.
leaving?
Right.
Um, but the answer to that was that like I was a big part of sort of finding my replacement. So
Gotcha. Gotcha. Um, and then, you'd mentioned at the beginning of this, right? Some of the fears around just starting a company. Like what, like, you know, um, for example, like, did you, what were you concerned about? Like just paying the bills, or like where would money come from, right? Because it doesn't show up um, regularly like a paycheck does.
yeah, so um, that side was pretty sort of clear to me because
Mhm.
Pipedrive was a VC funded company,
Mm, mhm,
and sort of like many of the sort of successful examples
mhm,
that I mentioned before, like were also VC funded companies.
mm.
So the sort of path, like even in theory, it was like from day one, it was like, okay, I should find some
Yeah.
investors,
Yep. Yep.
um, because it did not seem realistic that I would get to a point where customers would pay all the bills like anytime
Right.
soon, like at the time that I was sort of considering it.
Right.
So it was a pretty sort of quick decision that like we're gonna sort of
Hmm.
seek funding,
Right.
and we did. But like obviously, like when it came to hesitations, then even though we sort of had decided that we're gonna try to find an investor, like
Hmm.
we hadn't raised funding ever before.
Right.
Like, we didn't know like how that's supposed to work.
Yeah.
I mean, like we did. Everybody reads TechCrunch, and like more or less how those things go. And like
Right.
having been at Pipedrive, obviously, sort of also sort of
Hmm.
played a role because we had access to the founders and they sort of coached us a little bit and sort of like we could ask them questions, for example. Um, but still, like you can know all the theory you
Hmm.
want, but eventually you're the one that sort of has to
Right.
make that happen. And like that was like a completely new world for us, and
Yeah.
again, scary, you know.
Yeah. 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 No, definitely. I mean, it's, getting kind of, or approaching that, right? And that, um, without experience is super scary, right? Because there's a lot that you're going to have to learn along the way. Like while in the midst of pitching investors, you also have to learn how to pitch, right? You have to learn all these things as you go, right?
Yeah,
Um,
like somebody recommended a book to me that I knew had raised a lot of funding for his company, and I actually sort of read that particular book twice in a row. Like, so I
mhm.
finished it and then I started again because I really sort of felt like, okay, I should get the basics down.
Right.
Yeah.
And as you're thinking about kind of pitching investors and funding, right? And not and knowing that you don't know um, a lot about it, right? And you don't have experience with that part of things, right? Like what were the biggest things you were worried about? I was just even like thinking about like, you know, because you'd mentioned that, kind of getting investors was a part of the path, right? And so like it's kind of it sounded like it was a necessary step
Absolutely,
in
yeah.
this.
Yeah, I mean, that's like entire like other long, very very long list of like things that like we were concerned with. But like
Hmm.
the first one is it's especially when it's the first your first investor, then
Hmm.
it's a lot like sort of getting in a serious relationship. Like
Right.
it is. But also, like, there are sort of parallels to be drawn with like some personal relationships, maybe
Hmm.
because um, that investor will be with you for a very long time. Like if
Hmm.
things go like reasonably well.
Hmm.
So like it's not a decision to be made lightly. So
Yeah.
I guess the sort of it wasn't as much about
Hmm.
being concerned about like, oh, will we like get an investor at all? It was more about will we find one that is that
Mm.
feels like a good fit in time.
Right. 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 Because a bad investor could, or an investor that's not a great fit, right, could make things a lot more difficult for you than not
Yeah,
having an investor at all.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, um, again, like parallels to be drawn with like
Hmm.
finding a partner in life because
Yeah.
most people probably aren't concerned that they will be, know, they will be sort of completely alone forever necessarily. It's
Hmm.
just about like I want to find like the right person, and I want to avoid certain kinds of
Right.
characters, maybe.
Right.
And like at the end of the day, it's all human relationships.
Hmm.
Like whatever
Yeah.
your sort of title or position in that relationship is, it's human relationships, and like you want to find decent human beings.
Right. Right. So there's definitely a lot of questions that come up when you're thinking about quitting your job, right? Kind of doing this and taking a chance
Yeah.
on building a company, right? And there's a lot that you're potentially walking away from, right? You're kind of, because you've walked away from kind of growing with Pipedrive directly, right? As as an employee, as a head of support there, to take this chance, right? And so like, so there's a lot to think about. It's not a simple decision, and it kind of affects every aspect of your life, right? Your
Yeah.
career, um, and so I think what's going to be interesting is to kind of continue this conversation in future episodes, right? And kind of explore that journey, the stories that came up along the way and things that you've learned
Yeah.
along the way, and just to kind of see how it's come together. I also think this is super interesting because it's not, the story isn't over, right? The story is very much in progress.
Absolutely.
Cool.